Hi, my name is Justin K. Thompson. I am the production designer on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. As the production designer, it's my job to work with the directors to manage the overall look of the film and make sure that their vision winds up on screen.
In your universe, there's only one Spider-Man. But there is another universe. It looks and sounds like yours, but it's not. My name's Miles Morales.
Hey, kid. You're like me.
I think from the very beginning we wanted to emulate a comic book. We weren't exactly sure how we were going to pull that off. We just had this ambition that the comic book language that we had grown up with could really inform a really unique visual style. Since I grew up loving comic books, I wanted to see if there was a way to take all the little nuances of the printed page and turn them into a visual style. And slowly, working with Sony Pictures Imageworks, we developed this look through a lot of trial and error. It took a lot of effort, but we knew from the beginning we wanted to try and do something with it. There were definitely choices behind which techniques from the comic books we decided to use, but ultimately I think we started off not really knowing exactly where we were going to wind up. We didn't give ourselves any kind of rules. We didn't tell ourselves, oh, we should do this and should not do that. It was actually a very organic process of trial and error. What really drove my decision making was thinking about my directors and what tools they would need in order to tell a story visually. I think ultimately what people realize when they really study the film, almost every frame really wound up being massaged by hand because there was no way to get the computer to simulate everything, and there was no way to get the 2D artist to simulate everything that the computer could do. So it really became this blend between the 2D and the 3D that was always a back and forth between two-dimensional artists and three-dimensional artists, back and forth, and without that conversation between the two, the style wouldn't have developed. So when we were designing the color of the film, at every single stage, I asked myself what was important to the story. And when you first enter Manhattan, the thing that you see is that it's blue and green are the dominant colors. It's actually kind of dark and almost ominous. I wanted Manhattan to sort of represent symbolically this incredible, overwhelming sense of responsibility that Miles Morales stood to inherit. It was meant to give the audience a sense of foreshadowing of like what was to come. At the beginning of the film, he's reluctant to be Spider-Man. It's sort of this thing that Manhattan is this gigantic weight of responsibility, you know, being responsible for millions of people. It's not something Miles Morales wants at the start of the film. He wants to just be a normal kid growing up in Brooklyn. So I wanted the deep blues and greens to actually be what informed the look of Spider-Man. So the most important way that I thought about color on this film was balancing this idea of natural versus supernatural. So in scenes like this, where you're looking at Aunt May's house, I wanted those scenes to feel really grounded. I wanted them to feel really natural. I wanted those to feel like real places, places that Miles Morales would actually exist, or where Peter Parker would live, where Aunt May would actually live, places that we would recognize ourselves, places that we could live, so that when we went to more exaggerated supernatural places, that the color shift, when we went to these superhero moments between supervillains and superheroes, that's when the color would actually turn more vibrant and turn into this supernatural color palette that you're seeing. And that's when we introduced more comic book elements like the letters on screen and the word balloons and things like that. I think that was really important to do because I needed the audience to believe that Miles was a real kid who was actually encountering situations where there was real danger. And in order to feel that danger, we had to set him up from the beginning as a kid who came from a real place in Brooklyn, living in his dorm room with his roommate. And all these details that you see and all these comics that he's reading and the messiness of his room and the color palette, the naturalism, that was to make you feel that Miles was a real kid, so that when you went to these more supernatural moments, you would understand that he came from a real place where he lives with his parents. It's a warm, loving place that's a high contrast to the more unnatural, supernatural elements of the superhero world that he finds himself thrust into. So when it came to thinking about the villains in the film, I thought about how Miles Morales was a little kid. I talked to Shi-Yun Kim, the character designer, and the directors, and I think we all settled on this idea that he had these lanky limbs and these awkward feet and big hands, sort of like a young gazelle that hadn't quite grown into his own body yet. And he's trying to learn to control it, and we wanted him really expressive and believable as a human. But then the cool thing was to contrast that against these villains that he encounters. The first villain he sees is a Green Goblin, 22 feet tall. The reason we chose to do that was because I wanted to show that from the point of view of a 13-year-old boy. This suddenly would seem so overwhelming and so larger than life that it was almost too much to take in all at once. This 22-foot goblin who filled up the entire frame, and he sees Spider-Man fighting this gigantic beast. When we were designing Gwen Stacy's look, her look was really inspired by Jason Latour and Robbie Rodriguez's comic and Haley Steinfeld. The look that we put together is really meant to evoke how confident she is. We wanted her to be the most capable of all the Spider-Man. Each character had a sense of like really unique movement, and in her case, this drawing here is actually a drawing that Shi-Yun Kim remembered of a dancer that he went to school with. She would often use her feet like in all kinds of really interesting ways, and so he was inspired by that, and that kind of led to this ballet-inspired sense of movement and poses that we eventually gave the character. Jefferson Davis is one of my favorite characters in the movie. He epitomizes what we really aspired to in the film, which was to create a look that felt like these were people that you actually recognized, people you actually saw. Jefferson has such an expressive face that a lot of times when he's on screen, I really forget that I'm watching an animated film. He's sort of inspired by Brian Tyree Henry, who did the voice, and also a little bit by Peter Ramsey's father, who looks surprisingly like Jefferson. It wasn't intentional at first, but once we realized it, we sort of leaned into it. Another great character that is my personal favorite in the film was Doc Ock. Getting to reinterpret Doc Ock in a special way for this film was a really exciting treat as a fan and as a filmmaker. The idea that we're living in this alternate universe where it kind of gave us the freedom to do whatever we want, I think it was exciting to make her a woman so that the audience would be more surprised. They wouldn't be expecting this scientist to turn out to be Doc Ock. And I think it also gave us a chance to create a more original, unique character that suited Miles's reality. When we first started designing her, we were looking really closely at documentaries about scientists who work at NASA doing like quantum mechanics, and Shi-Yun Kim and Josh Beveridge looked really closely at the way characters in these documentaries we were watching were really acting. And they all had seemed to have such a fun way of moving and expressing themselves. When it came to her costume, I really wanted it to feel more like a prototype and more like something that was sort of unfinished and bizarre and not really quite easy to understand. And soft robotics had really just become this brand new technology that's been explored in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's sort of at the cutting edge of robotics. And I thought, well, I've seen so many mechanical arms, it was just cool to make something that just felt creepy, and it was just a really fun exercise. So here we're looking at Peter B. Parker. He's the 40-year-old version of the Peter Parker that we all grew up with, and I just thought from the very first read in the script, Phil Lord and Rodney Rothman, what they had done with this character, how they had turned him into this guy who had just seen a little too much and who was sort of questioning whether he still wanted to keep going. Like, was it still worth it to him to be a superhero? And I thought it was such a great opportunity for us as filmmakers to tell this story about this guy who had almost forgotten what was great about being a superhero, who wasn't even sure he wanted to do it anymore, and to make him the Mr. Miyagi to this kid who also didn't know if he wanted to be a superhero. And both of them sort of teach each other, and they learn from each other what's great about being a superhero, and they sort of inspire each other. That story is what hooked me and made me want to be a part of this movie from the very beginning. That central character relationship between mentor and student. And also it's just fun to see him eat pizza and be overweight and sad. So we're looking at a scene from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and this scene is really important because it's one of the first scenes we developed for the film, and as such we developed a lot of the techniques that we use throughout the film. So if we stop here, you can see the CMYK offset that is familiar in comic books is actually being used as a form of motion blur as the camera is going by. And here you're seeing hatching in the shadows, and you're seeing different screen tones over here in these halftones. And then again, to make things feel far away and make other things feel close, we had to develop a different technique for the offsets to deal with depth of field, so that these things would be more out of focus. But there really is no camera blur. It's actually just an offset where we took the image in three-dimensional space and shifted it apart and repeated it on top of itself. And then as we go forward, you're seeing a lot of the same techniques over and over again used in different ways. So these lights, to create a lens flare, we're using the same offset but in a different way in order to create a lens flare. And these Bende dots are used to create the highlight on the top of Kingpin's coat. Here, that offsetting technique that you're seeing that comes from comic book misprints, the CMYK offset misprints that you might get in a comic book, here we're using it not just for depth of field, where the midground's in focus, the foreground's out of focus, the background's out of focus, but we're also using it to create color accents where we're almost simulating a light bleed coming in from off screen into the camera. This is a great scene where you can like really clearly see all the hatching, the dots that we add. These dots aren't actually painted on the surface, they're actually projected by a light source onto each individual surface, and that's why they're all a little bit different from each other, because it depends on the angle of the light, the angle of the object, and the angle of view of what you see. Here, these dots that are coming out of the collider beam that make up these special effects that you see throughout the film were inspired by Jack Kirby's art from the 60s and 70s. His artwork is really famous for using these like sort of energy dots, and they became a signature that we used throughout the film, and at the end of the film it sort of became really important. Here you're seeing that Miles is actually moving. When you look at it slowly, it almost feels like it's moving choppy, but what we did is we're actually using techniques from 2D animation where we're actually animating on twos, repeating the same frame twice and then skipping the frame in between, so that when you play it at speed, it actually has this sort of cool sense of movement that feels almost like two-dimensional art. Here you'll see that the Kingpin's eyes start to get this offset shaking. Again, we were taking that CMYK offset that we saw in the comics and we were using it in different ways. In this case, purely as an expressive tool to express the way Kingpin is feeling inside his head. He's feeling amazed, and he's also feeling overwhelmed by the events that he's witnessing. So it was just something we said, that would just make the shot cooler. That was literally just why we did it. This explosion that happens at the end of the scene, this was all done by hand by the effects artists. All these little lines and these little wedges, they built them as individual pieces of geometry, attached different screen tones to each one and lighting to each one, and moved them through 3D space and layered them in 3D space so that you would actually have a two-dimensional graphic look moving in three-dimensional space, which was actually what I was asking for the entire movie. The original comics, whether it's Spider-Gwen, John Romita, or Steve Ditko, or even Todd McFarlane, and then of course Sarah Pichelli and Brian Michael Bendis's Miles Morales comics, that was important to me as a fan of comics to respect and to honor and to sort of take notice of what had been started by the artists who created those characters first and incorporate as much of it as possible. At all times, I think one thing that I was really concerned about was making sure that fans would recognize the things that they saw in the comics. As a fan myself, there's an expectation. You grow up, you love these characters, they become important to you, they become part of you. And to see it thrown out once it goes to the screen sometimes can be heartbreaking. So I know that feeling myself, so I was very careful about making sure that that stuff wound up on screen.